Hi, my name is Scott Loarie. I'm the co-director of iNaturalist, and I wanted to talk a little bit about iNaturalist for bee monitoring. So iNaturalist is a community science site, and first I wanted to talk about some of the advantages of community science in terms of building a constituency for nature and conservation and biodiversity. Then I wanted to talk about specifically the advantages of iNaturalist for generating bee data for biodiversity monitoring, and then talk a little bit about how you can do that. So starting out, a lot of people don't. A lot of people focus on uh, the ability for some of these projects and tools to generate data, and that's what I want to focus on. But I wanted to say that community science has a huge side benefit of really engaging, educating, involving the public. I think this is a huge advantage. So um, uh, even if there was a sort of more robotic approach for generating data, I think it's really important to consider these side benefits of getting the public outdoors, engaged, and caring about nature, because ultimately, if we're going to build conservation policy, we need to have a constituency, public support for it. And citizen science bakes that in because the public is involved at every point of the process. And that's important for not just getting the data we want, but also building the diversity and engagement that we need to have really good support for our conservation actions. But then specifically onto the ability to generate data. So iNaturalist generates most GBIF data for most species over recent years. So by recent years, I mean since 2020, and this is arbitrary, but it's the last 3 years, and it's a good 3 years is a good time period to think about in terms of if we really want to have real-time monitoring of biodiversity to be able to assess biodiversity on an annual basis more than a decadal basis. We really need to have systems that can get data into systems like GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, on the order of years. Naturalists can do that. If we look at the last 3 years, 89% of all records of bees on GBIF are from iNaturalist. Um, but a lot of people say, oh, sure, these citizen science sites like iNaturalist are great at generating a lot of data, but it's not getting the biodiversity. They're not capturing the diversity of bees that we get from more traditional methods. Um, so I wanted to argue that that's not the case. And to do that, I wanted to look at a graph similar to this. So what this is that same data, all those GBIF records from the US for bees since 2020, but it's plotting them with, on the x-axis is the number of species, and on the y-axis is the number of observations. So on the very left-hand side, we see Western honeybee, which has 83,000 records on GBIF from the last 3 years. So it is that single species is accounting for a huge percentage of all of the data in GBIF. But then as we move towards the right, you can see species that have less and less representation on GBIF. So if we go over to the notch-backed cellophane cuckoo bee, that species only has 100 records on GBIF. So it's in like a 100th place. And this is a log graph. So it's important to realize if this wasn't on the log scale, it would just look like an elbow. And then we get all the way to the right side where there's species with just one observation. So again, GBIF has about 1,000 species represented from the United States for bees from the last 3 years. So this is a good graph to kind of capture what we want, is not just to have a lot of data, but to have a lot of data distributed across a lot of species. And sure, this is a long tail distribution, but you can see from this how that balance is struck. This next graph is the exact same data, but it's split out into two groups. So this is the iNaturalist contribution to GBIF, and then the contribution to GBIF from all the other publishers. So GBIF has data from 81,000 different data sets. I'm not sure how many are relevant to bees in the United States, but it's probably many hundreds, if not thousands. And so what's interesting about this is that on the left-hand side, the iNaturalist graph is higher. So that means that more data is coming for these common species like Apis mellifera, Western honeybee, for iNaturalist than these more traditional data sets, which is expected. I think this is what a lot of people expect is, wow, iNaturalist is just generating huge amounts of honeybees and colorful, charismatic bumblebees and things like that. But what I think is kind of surprising and interesting is if you go to the right-hand side of the graph, you remember these are the underrepresented species. iNaturalist is still generating more data for those underrepresented species than the traditional methods or the other data sets getting into GBIF. And I know GBIF isn't all data, but it's a good representation of sort of lots of different biodiversity data sources. This is that same data, but shown even another way. So this is the percentage of species on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the percentage of their observations from iNaturalist, looking at this same subset of GBIF records from 2020 to 2023. And what's interesting is, so about 40% of bee species on GBIF recorded over the last 3 years only have data from iNaturalist. 100% of their data comes from iNaturalist. But this point at 61%, I think, is interesting. So what that's saying is 61% of species have at least 61% of their records from iNaturalist. That point where the those two statistics equal themselves, I was inspired by the H index. So like an academic will say, my H index is X, which means I have at least X number of publications with at least X number of citations. So it's just a nice way of capturing the two qualities we want. We don't just want one observation from all these species, and we don't just want all of our observations from one species. We want lots of observations from lots of species. And iNaturalist does that. It gets it's contributing significantly to GBIF, both in terms of the number of species and the number of observations per species, so that we can say that most species on GBIF from the last 3 years, most bee species from the United States, 61%, have most of their data, 61%, from iNaturalist. So again, this argument that even aside from the benefits of community science, of engaging the public, building constituency, citizen science at the moment is where the bulk of observations and diversity in terms of species is coming into GBIF. So it's a really important tool in our arsenal to really do native bee monitoring in the United States. So last, I wanted to quickly talk about how to do this. So the first is to use iNaturalist to add observations and coordinate observers. So adding observations is something you can do by yourself. I think of it as like going for a run. You can go for a run by yourself. You can go out in your backyard and take some pictures of bees, but you also can organize a 10K run with your local running chapter. And this is where I think is a really important role for, especially for people in the professional the professional institutions around the United States working on bees, is to coordinate observers. So put on things like BioBlitzes. These are getting people outdoors. You can use iNaturalist to set these up. It will do all the tallying for you, and give them marching orders. We're going to see how many bees we can observe in this place today, and we're going to compare and see how we're doing. Another thing you can do, which is, remember, iNaturalist, a lot of these observations are not identified. They're just sitting at B or higher. So one of the most important things you can do if you have identification skills is go to iNaturalist, make an account, go to Explore, and then type in, here I typed in bees in the United States. So I'm filtering from just bees in the United States, and then click on Identify, which is there in the lower right-hand side. And that brings up the Identify tool. And this is a really efficient tool. If you have expertise in identifying bees, just to click through these, all of these observations need identifications, either because they're sitting at bees or some higher taxon like a genus, or they just don't have enough support to become what we call research grade, which is the criteria we use to send to GBIF. So you can just click on those, click on Add ID, and we even have keyboard shortcuts. So this is really efficient if you get good at this, and just, if you know what this is, type it in and click save. And those two steps, getting observations into the system and getting identification into the systems, are really the bread and butter of iNaturalist's capacity to play an important role in bee monitoring by generating the diversity of species of native bees data in GBIF, and also the volume, which is important. So thank you so much.